Good evening, everyone. We welcome you on behalf of the KR Cama Oriental Institute. We look forward to this wonderful event this evening with the most prestigious people on the dais who's going to conduct the event on behalf of us. You may start the event, madam.
Thank you so much, Yasmin. Thank you for inviting us. And thank you all of you for being here, and many thanks especially to the participants. Sindhi Tapestry is a collection of essays to do with the Sindhi identity. I got the idea for this book several years ago. Identity, as we all know, is a very complex sort of thing, and for Sindhis, it's particularly complex. Things were a certain way when they lived in Sindh, and then after partition, when they moved to live in different places and adapted to new lives, everything changed. In Sindh, religious identity had been one thing. After partition, it became something else. And similarly, language identity, clothing, being connected to a place, all those identities changed as well. It's been about 10 years now since I started interviewing elderly Sindhis, and I've been intrigued with the many facets of identity within this community. It's a reality so much in contrast to the shallow, unidimensional perception of Sindhis in India. So for a long time, I wanted to share the rich realities of Sindhi identity, and it was during the lockdown that I started working on it. I contacted people who I knew would be interested in contributing, some of them researchers on Sindh and the Sindhis, and some of them thinkers interested in the subject, and each of them with wonderful stories to tell. The range of thoughts and experiences in these essays and their richness and depth is quite remarkable. So this book, Our Lockdown Baby, came out extremely well, and it received a lot of attention too. What we're doing is, we will first start with a session by Dr. Matthew Cook on Sufism, script, and Sindhi culture. And then we go on to Dr. Maya David Khemlani, who is going to speak about language. That's one of her themes, which she's done a lot of research on. And what she actually did was she took the book, she read the book's Tapestry, and she studied it. Now, Tapestry actually is a collection of 60 essays by different people on different themes of identity. And she picked out language as one of the most important things that everybody was talking about. So she's going to tell us what she learned from there. And then we have Nandu Asrani, who is actually a hereditary. When I say hereditary, he actually has a pedigree lineage. His ancestors were businessmen in a historical trade route, which he's going to tell you about. And also he will tell you about what he learned. It's a very interesting talk indeed. And then we come to Shakuntala Bharwani, who is going to talk about cultural characteristics of Sindhis, partly the characteristics which are a cultural legacy, and partly the legacy of partition. So, when Subhash and I were planning this event, that's Dr. Subhash Vijlani, who will be summing up after the talks are completed. We decided that we'll start at the top of the pyramid and do a research overview, which is from Dr. Cook, and then move on to language, which concerns everybody, again, from a research point of view. And then more, towards the base of the pyramid, business being a very important aspect of the Sindhi community, and then move on to the cultural traits. So I'm going to ask Matthew Cook, can you please start with your session, please, Nat?
For sure, wonderful. I just want to say thank you, Saz, for organizing this great event, getting us all here, getting us all muted. By and large, also is always a task. I know, having done a lot of these in the last year and a half. And I just want to also thank everyone for coming up and showing. And y'all have things to do with your time, and I appreciate it that you've decided to spend your time with us and this evening, if you're in South Asia, or this morning if you're in North America, like I am, or somewhere in between, like Maya, who's in Malaysia. So wherever you're joining us from, thank you for joining us today. So what I'm going to do is I have a presentation. It'll be about 10 to 15 minutes. I've tried to keep it closer to 10. I have some slides that Saz is going to work through with me as I go through the presentation. I'll speak against the slides. I actually have the pictures over here on my other computer, so if I look over here occasionally, essentially I'm just keeping myself on track and looking at my own slides while you're watching the ones that Saz puts up. So Saz, you want to start with slide number 1, which is the cover of the book. Okay, all right, here we go. A striking feature of Sindhi Tapestry is its cover and its patchwork design, which is based off of traditional Sindhi tapestries or covers, which if it weren't black behind me, you'd be able to see 2 or 3 in this room with me.
Wow.
If you can go to the next slide, you can see a picture of one of those tapestries I pulled off the web. This tapestry image is in fact constant with how some Sindhis describe their sociocultural identities as an amalgamation process.
What's the program now? Otherwise you will miss the article.
I think we still have some people who need to mute.
Okay, Daddy, now you see it.
Sunita, can you please mute?
Oh, sorry.
That's okay, no worries. So this image, the cover of the book, this image is in fact constant with how some Sindhis describe their sociocultural identities as an amalgamation process. And in scholarly terms, this patchwork process could be labeled syncretism. Despite a seemingly positive connotation, syncretism is not without critics. Carl Ernst and Tony Stewart, for example, caution against using the term. They describe how syncretism can result from violent domination. For example, when one group conquers a different group. Considering Ernst and Stewart's critique, it's worthwhile reevaluating the idea that Sindhi identities are syncretic. So Oz, can we get the next slide, which is the book, cover of the book that I did with Michelle and Julian. There we go. So considering Ernst and Stewart's critique, it's worth reevaluating the idea that Sindhi identities are syncretic. Sindhis create their identities not from mere historical mixing or a patchwork process, but from sociocultural code switching that transgresses boundaries by intertwining them. Rather than simply conclude that Sindhi identity is syncretic, the region's intertwined sociocultural character points towards seeing how it is a zone in which people's lives are not constituted by a mixture of parts so easily separated as a patchwork would suggest. Let me give just one example today of how 2 key threads of Sindh's sociocultural identity are in fact intertwined: Sufism and the Naskh writing system. I might add that both of these are symbolically referenced on the cover of Saz's book, Sindhi Tapestry. Saz, can we go to the next slide? There we go. So most people on this Zoom session likely know that Sindhi is conventionally written in Naskh, or an Arabic system for writing. What I don't think most people completely understand, or is popularly known, is that it's conventionally written in Naskh because of, or on account of a report written by Sir Richard Burton in the late 1840s, which advocated for the use of Naskh for the Sindhi language. And actually, this is page 1 of part of that report that I pulled out of the archive. And I pulled this particular chart out of a much larger set of argumentation and document because it's interesting is what it does is it details, if you will, sort of Burton's thinking and approach towards language and culture very interestingly. It's hard to tell in this particular slide, but what he does is off to the left, he details Devanagari, and you can see that running down in the column next to the numbers, and he contradicts it to what he calls Naski Arabic, is what it says up at the top. And below, he subdivides those particular ciphers into their final, medial, and initial forms. And then, which I'm not going to talk too much about, is he adds in the last column, it's actually contrasted with Punjabi, specifically in its Shahmukhi form, not in its Gurmukhi form, which we'll see later in another slide. Now, Burton actually most likely ripped off his entire writing system in this report from Abu Hassan al-Sindhi, also known as Muqdam Abu Hassan Tatwi, who was, historically known as a scholar and the founder of a 40-character writing system based on Arabic for Sindhi. So, Saz, can we just sort of go to the next slide or so here? There we go. And this is just a continuation of Burton's report and the chart where he outlines the writing system for Sindhi and advocates for it to be Nask, as opposed to a variety of other systems he goes through. But we unfortunately don't have sort of time to go into that. That's another talk, maybe on another time and day. So can we keep going, Saz? And then he just keeps going through the chart where he lays out, the different forms. And then, of course, he comes to the issue of how to deal with the particular sounds in Sindhi, because as many of you know, there are sounds that occur phonologically in Sindhi that are not common in Hindi or even in Sanskrit. So he had to come up with some new signs for this. Usually Burton dealt with this issue by adding new dots to letters as a sort of general statement. Saz, can we go to the next slide? Okay. So Burton's system, writing system advocacy, that is, reflects a communal and colonial ideology about South Asia, that it consists of Hindus and Muslims. And we see this most clearly in another chart that's incurred within his report, where we see very clearly that he divides, if you will, the writing systems of the area up into those that are what he calls Sanskrit, which is on the right, on the left, next to the numbers, and of course what he calls Arabic and then English on the other side. Now, in this sense, Burton's system represents a case of what we call in linguistic anthropology fractal recursivity. And Saz, can you give me the next slide for that? That one's out of space. Keep going. There we go. Keep going. Sorry to sort of go through all these. There we go. Now, I'm not going to get too much into the academic debates about it, particularly from linguistic anthropology, about fractal recursivity. But the important thing to sort of highlight here is that integral to the idea of fractal recursivity is that the same oppositions and contrasts that distinguish given groups from each other on larger scales can be found to be operating at various other scales, spatial and sociocultural. And in this particular case, I think what's important to realize is that the all India religious opposition and communal oppositions of Hindus versus Muslims get played out at the regional level of Sindh in Burton's scripting system and his advocacy for Nask. Now, this process, fractal recursivity, involves what we call a great amount of erasure. And again, I'm not going to go into the sort of details of debates about some of the jargon that are relevant but not important in this context. But erasure, what it is it involves the erasure of any differentiation that is, according to the given ideology, in this point, a communal ideology juxtaposing Hindus and Muslims, as inconsequential, something in fact to be discounted, to be disregarded, and otherwise ignored. Roz, can you get the next slide? Now, just how much of the needlework of Sindhi society and culture Burton's script system advocacy ignores or erases to indexically bleach the cultural colors out of the Sindhi Tapestry is clearer when we look at actually the original script that the British selected for the Sindhi writing system. And that would be George Stack's system of Kudabadi or Kudawadi. He was stationed in Kudabad in Sindh, so it was named after the location that he was. Now, let me just give you a little quick background before, looking at these very quickly and moving on to sort of my final thoughts, is that the British actually in the late 1840s had this big, huge debate about what writing system would be appropriate for the Sindhi language, with the ideology, if you will, of one language, one writing system, one culture. And in this process, there were two major characters. One was George Stack, who advocated for this system you see in front of you, called Kudabadi or Kudawadi. And then in response, you had Sir Richard Burton advocate for Nosk. And there was a big, huge debate. It goes on for hundreds of pages in the colonial archives about what system should be used, whether or not they should use Stack's system, whether or not they should use Burton's system. And interestingly enough, the British actually decide to use Stack's system, or to do Kudawadi or Kudabadi, in the late 1840s. And frankly, this was shocking. I had no idea about this. And the question that I had then working through the archive was, well, why is it that the modern Sindhi writing system looks nothing like this Kudabadi thing, and everything like Nosk? Now, in the process of thinking through that issue, we have to sort of address the point of how much and what cultural colors are bleached out of the tapestry by Burton. And we can look at this slide here. It's self-explanatory. He lays out Stack here. He lays out the various forms of the letters, and then he actually creates the short form starting below. As you can see, it's written in Devanagari over on the left, all the way at the bottom, a standard unaspirated ka sound, and then he gives the same sound in a Kudabadi or Kudawadi character as ka, and then he does in fact the long and short i's, so ki, ki, and then he goes on to doing other ka and ka, and then he does long and short e's, so ki and ki, and he goes on adding the various different short markers, as we have familiarly do with Devanagari. And he keeps going on doing that, laying out the entire system. Saz, you want to move to the next slide so we can see the rest of Stack's report? So he goes through with every single consonant and creates the short form versions for the vowels to connect to the consonants. All right, next one, please. Of course, I should have been a little suspicious when I saw that Stack himself actually couldn't get it right and had to correct himself. That's what that little squiggly line is. But again, that's another talk. Saz, next slide, please. So sorry, this is a little small, but on the right we have the report, the front page of that report and chart that Burton presented. And we have actually another chart on the left side, which outlines Burton's sort of grander understanding of the possibilities of the Sindhi writing system choice. So as I said, Burton basically said, we have a choice between Devanagari and we have a choice between Nosk. And the point I'm trying to make here is this is a false choice based on the historical realities on the ground in Sindh. And that this choice, in fact, removes a huge amount of the cultural diversity that was on the ground. And you can't see it very well, but I'll get to it in a sec. Up at the top of the second slide. So what we see from Stack's chart as opposed to Burton's chart is that we see that Sindh was actually made up of various different types of quote unquote Hindus and Muslims. And these different communities and groups were socioculturally indexed according to their writing systems, which stood in as symbols of their identity. And if we, again, look at the top of the chart on the left, again, it's hard to see, I apologize, but the first column is Devanagari. The second column is Gurmukhi. The third column is what is called Ochuka Punjabi, which is essentially Multani script, which is from the Saraiki region, which depending on whether or not you're Sindhi or Punjabi is Northern Sindhi or Southern Punjabi. And then there is, in the next one over, number 4 is Kudawadi or Kudabadi, which is what Stack was advocating to be. And the British government accepted to be initially the writing system for the Sindhi language. The next one over is a joint column. Up at the top box, it actually says Tatai. And then below it, it refers to Lohanas and Bhatia. The next column over is Larai, which is, of course, a reference to Lari, which is the dialect of Sindh spoken in the southern regions of that province. And then moving on over, third from last, it says Quojas, Maimons as the second to last, and finally it says Roman character in the end. So in conclusion, what I want to say here is based on these sort of comparison of reports and the conflict and debates that happened between Burton, Stack, and others, is that Burton's indexical bleaching of the Sindhi society and culture and its erasure, if you will, of certain features, in fact enabled an increasingly predominant thread to be ever more woven into the Sindhi tapestry starting from the mid-19th century onward. And that's the thread of Sufism. Because the prominent Sufi texts, like the Shadro Rizalo, were all originally written in Naskh, or in Burton's advocacy system, and not in Stack's system. And in fact, Burton argues very effectively that the Kudawadi system for which Stack is advocating has no literature. And because a language must have a literature, it's not possible to advocate for Stack's use of Kudawadi. This sort of position was then picked up by Bertolt Freyer later on. And again, I won't get to that, that whole set of debates of back and forth, but it was Bertolt Freyer then who in fact ended up selecting the system after Stack had died and after Burton had left Sindh permanently. So in this sense, and this is the sort of driving force that I'm trying to get at here and put on the table, in this sense, Burton's advocacy for Naskh intertwines socioculturally with the subsequent and strong emergence of Sufism as a core symbol in and an icon of Sindhi society and culture from the mid-19th century onward. This is what Michel Boivin has talked about as the Sufi paradigm. And if any of you haven't read his work recently published by Palgrave, I would suggest you check it out. I would sort of push the envelope even further and say that this strong connection and intertwining between the writing system and Naskh and Sufism was so much so that I would argue that it's actually impossible to claim, as so many do, that Sindhis are Sufi by nature, that without Burton's advocacy for Naskh and its report on it, one would not actually be able to make that sociocultural assertion, as many people do. So I think what I'll do is I'll just leave that on the table, and we'll probably have a lot of debate between me and the, sorry, didn't get to the last, sorry, I got into the presentation. But this is a copy of the Shadro Rizalo from, it looked like 1270H, so that's 1857, late 1857. So hopefully we'll have an opportunity to talk more about this later. I'm sure Maya and I will have lots to talk about, given my linguistic turn here. So I just want to say thank you, everyone. And I guess I'll turn it back. I'll mute myself and turn it over to our host, to Saz.
Thank you so much, Matt. Thank you. And that was extremely interesting. And as you said, I think there's going to be good discussion about the points you brought up today. I think unfamiliar to many of us. And we'll go on now to Maya. Maya, would you please unmute yourself and take over?
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Saz, for that wonderful book, which actually helped me a lot because it saved me from doing research, which you did. So thank you, Saz. Basically, I also want to thank all the writers of the book because I went through every article and I was just looking at language. As a social linguist, I'm interested in finding out why people move away from their languages, because often it has been said, if you lose your language, you lose your culture. But that's another research that I have talked about elsewhere, whether there's a connection between language and culture, although many linguists say there's a very, very strong connection between language and culture. If you lose your language, you lose your culture. But here today, I'm more interested in finding out why people lose their language. And many social linguists are more interested in finding out if they have lost their language, if they have shifted away from their language. And then they start documenting the language if they have shifted away from the language. But I wanted to know why the Sindhis in diaspora have actually moved away from the language. And thanks to Saz and her book, and thanks to all the writers, I was able to go through the book, look at everyone's writing in relation to language-related issues. So the focus of this talk is, why have the diasporic Sindhi Hindus shifted away from their heritage language? Because when a speech community replaces a local language, replaces their mother tongue with a local language, then we talk about language shift, sometimes language death also. So the attitude of a language community regarding their language is a significant component in language maintenance or shift. So this particular research addresses the question of why have the Sindhis, the Sindhi Hindus all over in different parts of the world moved away from their heritage language. A lot of studies have been done about language shift of the Sindhi Hindu community in Manila, in Hong Kong, in Singapore, in London, and in Malaysia. And in all these places, they have talked about language shift of these communities, of this community. So what I did was, looking at Saz's edited book, I was looking at the work and the memories and the writings of different people, and second generation younger people are talking about their parents. So we want to know the generation one, the parents who shifted away from Sindh and moved over to India and other countries. What was their attitude towards the language? And going through the writings of a number of people, it is very clear they are talking about their parents, and it's a very positive attitude towards assimilation. Can we move to the table, please, Sas? All right, so we have different people. Subhash Bijani actually says, my father attended classes to learn Hindi, as all central government employees were required to possess a minimum working knowledge of Hindi. Sindhi was beginning to fade from our lives. So these are the words of Subhash with regards to his father regarding the first generation who had to leave Pakistan, who had to leave Sindh. Kusum Chopra on page 64 actually says, and I quote, "Their efforts to merge had been at a huge sacrifice in encouraging their young to adapt to the local languages and languages which would give them an edge. They had lost their own." Again, this notion of moving away from the mother tongue to earn a livelihood, to give their children a chance in the new countries they had moved to. Anju Makija on page 330 says, "Due to the jolt of partition, many of us lost our language." And again, referring to the first generation, she says, "My parents were busy settling down and keen to give us a convent education. In the process, they did not concentrate on teaching in Sindhi, and by convent education, it would have been English language education." Namrata Asudani on page 333 says, and I quote, "They came to a new land where they were not entirely welcome, where they had to struggle against the biases of language, the stigma of being called refugee, to make a future for their families." Notice the focus, to make a future for their families, where there was a bias against the Sindhi language. I do understand, and this is the second generation understanding why I was never thought to speak Sindhi as a child. My amalgamation was more important than identity. So basically, there was a positive attitude towards assimilation as seen in the voices of the diasporic Sindhi Hindus when they refer to generation one, their parents. And because of the plus point of learning the language of the country they had moved to, and the minus point of using Sindhi. And so I move on to the next table where I look at the negative social attitudes. Can we move to the, yeah. So these are negative social attitudes, mainly in many countries, but mainly in India. The Sindhi Hindu refugees faced negative social attitudes towards their language, their culture, and identity. And such attitudes against their language and their culture resulted in moving away from their language. And I quote this time from different people. Dharmendra Tolani on page 11 to 12 says, and he is quoting a teacher who said, when he was a young boy, a teacher was saying to a friend of his who was sitting next to him, he said, "You should be ashamed of yourself eating with a Sindhi, though you are," and he leaves this blank, meaning you are not a Sindhi. And then, Sindhis are well-known beggars. Sindhis are thieves. If you see a snake and a Sindhi together, kill the Sindhi first. And this is as cited by Dharmendra Tolani. As a young child, he remembers these things about his teachers, non-Sindhi teachers, and also about what others said about the Sindhi community. Atul Khatri on page 54 says, "People made fun of us when I was a kid, calling us Chindi Sindhis, stuff like that." Again, making fun of the language. Nina Satnani says, "I was teased for my surname, for my language, for my clothes. For long, I had hidden my Sindhi identity out of fear and mortification." So being afraid to use the language because people make fun of you. And even the surname with an A-N-I ending, signaling that you are a Sindhi. Not all Sindhis have A-N-I ending, but this surname also resulted in her hiding out of fear. And very strong language, fear and mortification. And Nandita Bhavnani on page 35 and again on page 36 says, "I have always been an outsider having to speak another language in the hope of being seen in a favorable light. So if I speak Sindhi, I'll be looked at negatively. So if I speak another language which is viewed positively, I'll be looked at favorably. So Sindhi, again, Nandita says on page 36, Sindhi is a secret language coded against an uncomprehending society. It lives in privacy, not out there in the public. So again, this idea of the need to use Sindhi, perhaps only in the home. It's a secret language. But, you know, even if you have house help in the home, then it's no more a secret language. So many of the Sindhis, both young and senior, were looked down upon by other communities at that point in time. Of course, the scenario has changed now, but at that point in time when they came in as refugees, there were many negative traits, beggary, kleptomania, were associated with the community. And such negative attitudes towards the Sindhis were also held by even teachers who prevented students of other communities from socializing with the Sindhis. Even Sindhi names and clothes were seen as symbols of cultural degradation, causing the Sindhis not to disclose their ethnic identity in public. Living such a life, the Sindhis hope to be socially accepted by the host communities of India. In a more recent paper, I talk about public online platforms, which are now resulting in Sindhi being seen more positively rather than it was seen at that point in time. Remember, the people I'm citing are talking about their parents, their time when they were young, and how they were treated and how they felt like. But today, hopefully, there is a change with these new platforms advertising the pride of being Sindhi. I move on to the final point and the third table. And this, can we move on? Yes, this is the third table, the urge for cosmopolitanism. Another reason for the shift among the community was their desire to maintain a cosmopolitan identity. And the responses of the writers in Saz's book are again provided. Karun Sakarani on page 108 says, can't read or write Sindhi? No problem. Can't trace the roots of the family? No problem. I'm living the life of a global entrepreneur. Sorry, somebody is not muted. I'm living the life of a global entrepreneur, hospitable and family-oriented Sindhi. So you see what has happened. If I can't speak the language, no problem. If I can't write the language, no problem. But what is important? I'm a global citizen. I'm an entrepreneur. I am hospitable. I help people. I give things to people, and I'm family-oriented. So the shift from a focus on language to other variables has become important. Kishore Mandayan on page 383 says, what difference does it make whether my children are fluent in Sindhi, Gujarati, French, or Japanese? They must grow up not to be lords of a minor locality or corner. They must grow up to be princes of the world. Sindhis have truly made the world their home. So again, this notion of we belong to the world, we can live anywhere, that's more important to be able to have a good life else anywhere rather than of a small community. Raj Lal Chandani says, we may not know our language perfectly, yet we speak many foreign languages fluently. We don't have a homeland, yet the world belongs to us. So again, this focus on home being the world being the home, being entrepreneurs. And I know the next speaker is going to talk about entrepreneurship. So that's important because, you know, their identity is entrepreneurship, not so much language as they see it. So Gitanjali Cairo says, it is our business ethic passed on from generation to generation that leads to our identity. So what we see here is the diaspora Sindhi Hindus living in different countries of the world do not see their identity in the ability to speak the Sindhi language. They believe that business ethic, close family ties are marked features of their cosmopolitan identity. And they wish to preserve and transmit this identity to their successive generations. Such an emphasis on cosmopolitan identity has also been an important reason for language shift. So, in conclusion, this book has been an important resource for finding out why people shift away from their language. And it's a very useful book because we hear the voices of different people of talking about the first generation and talking about their own lives when they were young. It is clear, therefore, that the diasporic Sindhi Hindu community shifted away from the habitual use of their language due to economic reasons. Remember the person saying that his father needed to know Hindi to get a job in India. Educational person who said, my parents sent us to convent schools where English was used. And social reasons. So diaspora participant narratives taken from Saz's book, Sindhi Tapestry, were very useful to help me as a social linguist to demystify reasons for language shift. Thank you, Saz, and thank you to all the writers. Because of you, I've been able to find out reasons for language shift of the Sindhi diaspora. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Maya. That was a wonderful talk. You really read that book and pulled out so many lessons from it. And I think that's so useful to have it articulated the way you have. And I'm glad you ended with that business ethic as the identity, because as you said, the next speaker is Nandu.
Hi everybody, and a very good evening to all of you, and a special thanks to the KR Cama Institute for having us here and giving us an opportunity to talk about this wonderfully compiled, wonderfully edited and wonderfully presented book by Saz Agarwal. In my essay in the book, I'm basically I've written about our family business history right from 1898 to the present, where my great-grandfather, Nandu Asrani, set up a trading firm alongside, there were 20 or 22 other similar trading firms, most of them from Shikarpur, Sindh. And this trading firm involved, it involved a three-way trades of goods, handicrafts and spices and other things. A three-way trade between India, Russia and Iran. And it was extremely profitable and extremely viable. It went on till the next 2 decades, little more than 2 decades. It was only after the Russian Revolution, a few years after the Russian Revolution, that things went very bad because there was a devaluation in the Russian currency, and most of them went bankrupt. They all had to shut shop. My great-grandfather he salvaged whatever he could, but yet he was almost near bankruptcy and he had to shut down and start all over again. And I've also spoken about my grandfather's experience in business in setting up offices, Shikarpuri finance offices in Trichinopalli and Bombay. And how he faced setbacks, especially after the partition. I have also written mainly about his advice given to me at various stages in my life and my career. And I was lucky in the sense that when I started my business and when I was young and when I started my professional life. He was in his 60s and he was fairly active in business and he had a sharp mind. And his pieces of advice and ideas and suggestions, motivation have not only helped me in my business and my general life in general, but has also made me lead a very interesting life. I mean, I've been able to do so many things, so many businesses, so many sports, all because of a basic underlying philosophy and his ideas and his suggestions. We had this habit as a family, joint family, to all sit down together and talk about the past, the stories of business stories of my grandfather, his father, and his father and his Nana, who was one of the most wealthiest, prosperous businessman and philanthropist in Chicago. So we were lucky. I was very lucky in that sense that I had somebody at that age and with such wonderful experience in business, handling setbacks and failures and giving me such nuggets of advice, which I think I've covered in the book. And also apart from business, a lot of interesting stuff, a lot of interesting anecdotes from the past, like how we Sindhis have this habit of scotch. It's not something new. It's there since hundreds of years. In fact, he even told us the brands which his father and his grandfather used to have in those days. So it's a lot of interesting stuff. Anyway, coming back to the essay. So there were 4 important things which he emphasized on in a nutshell. So the first one is that whatever the case may be, your reputation has to be intact. Your reputation has to be fantastic in business. The way you conduct yourself in business, the way you conduct yourself in life and relationships, and especially in business, it is the most important asset in the balance sheet. I mean, you can go bankrupt, which my great grandfather went through, but because he paid back everything somehow or the other and managed to get back on his feet, he could start the extremely successful Shikharpuri banking business in Trichinopalli and subsequently in Bombay. So he said, if your reputation is good, things generally work out well and people trust you. That is the number one thing you can do in business, which I have really practically applied all my life. No matter what, I have made sure that money has been paid back to lenders, suppliers are paid on time in every time. So the second thing is, which I think is a general trait in most Sindhis, I think, is basically to develop, to make people like you. Because in business, he gave me this bit of advice that you don't need to be very shrewd or very smart or very calculative. Of course, you need to have calculations in place and things like that. What it means that people like you. If people genuinely like you, and this is something which you can't just put on an act, you have to develop that likability, that people actually like you. So if people like you, obviously they would like to do business with you, and that is what I have consciously tried to create in myself, and which has worked very well from the day I've started my business, my advertising agency. So that is something which I think is invaluable, and I suspect the very fact that Sindhis have dispersed all over the world, especially after partition and much before that also, they have easily blended into local communities, local cultures. They have become part of the local population. And that's the reason I think they have succeeded. I mean, Sindhis are generally very likable people. And that is the second thing. The third thing is that one should be very flexible and nimble footed, not only in business, in life, but probably more in business. That if things don't work out, you should take a quick decision. And this has helped me tremendously. it has helped me in the sense that there were so many ventures as an entrepreneur you start, and then because of so many factors you just don't want to shut it down. So but if you are flexible, you are quick, you decide fast, you can get out of trouble, so that flexibility is again something which I think Sindhi, it's a common trait. They are quick to move on, quick to restart, quick to adapt to new ideas, to new people. So I think that is a very invaluable asset. I mean, in this book, there is a chapter written by Atul Khatri, which is absolutely fascinating. I mean, he was a businessman who was dealing in, I think, software or something. And he, at the age of 45 or 50 something, he became such a famous, he turned himself around, reinvented himself. And today I think he's the topmost stand-up artist, which is absolutely amazing. I mean, this is something which many Sindhis possess. And the fourth is, of course, that, he said that whatever you do, you should always do some charity in some form. I mean, in the sense, help the needy in whatever capacity you can, not necessarily in terms of money, but in terms of time, effort. So my grandfather's Nana, which is his maternal grandfather, Nana, he had set up a big hospital in Shikarpur. So he was Rai Bahadur Udavdas. He had set up Tarachand. He had set up a huge hospital in Shikarpur, which is yet functional today. It's absolutely free for all. And my grandfather and his father set up, constructed a hospital in Trichinapalli in my great grandmother's name, which is yet functional and is now run by the local authorities. And we also as a family do whatever we can by way of helping the needy. So that is something which I think we follow religiously. So these four nuggets of advice and wisdom have helped me enormously in my entire life, not only in business, but in many facets of life, in sports and other activities. I've started so many businesses as an entrepreneur. Some are successful, many have failed, but that has not really affected me much because after hearing these stories of partition, not only my family but other families, how they had the tenacity to get up and start again. They could have resorted to violence, they could have complained, they could have done so many other things, but they just as a Sindhi trait, they just decided to just brush everything apart and get back to trying to rebuild again, which is, I think, a phenomenal trait in our community, and I'm really proud of that fact, and that keeps me going. In the sense, when you know that these guys like my grandfather and their generation have actually, pulled it off, and they are so successful in a short period of just 20-30 years after the partition, or maybe less than that. So that is something which is a very motivating factor for me. So that is a trait in Sindhis. I mean, when people talk about Sindhis as snakes, some proverb which says, some saying that "Saap ya this thing pehle Sindhi ko maro," which is absolutely absurd and stupid. I get pretty angry at that. I've mentioned it in my book that Sindhis are definitely no snakes at all. You visit any Sindhi's house and you will know that how generous we are, and the first thing we'll offer you is a drink, a scotch. So you can't really talk about Sindhis as snakes, but I would put them as, I would say that they are spiders. A spider is somebody with a lot of resilience, a lot of perseverance, and they keep falling from their web and they fall down, and when we clean their houses, the next day you see they are again rebuilding their web or their base or whatever. So that is what a Sindhi is all about, with a strong character, with a never say die spirit. And that is what I hope I have tried to explain in the chapter, and I hope it reaches across to people and people change their perception of Sindhis. So I hope that this book reaches out to many other people besides Sindhis. It's a fabulously edited and compiled book. Very amazing stories and very amazing things about culture, food, religion, business, way of life, and stories on partition. It's absolutely fascinating. And yeah, so that's about it. And looking forward to any interaction or questions. Take care. Bye bye.
Thank you so much, Nandu. That was such a fantastic narration. It was extremely interesting to hear about the history and also the business secrets, which I think many of us can learn from. So I want to go on now to Shakuntala Bharwani.
Thank you, Kama Institute, and thank you, Saz, for taking off so much of your time and energy to organize this. It's really wonderful the way you give your time to us. Yeah, I have a very general talk, and it's on the culture of Sindhis. And the point that I want to start off with, what attracted me the most was, even when I read Sindhi Tapestries, was that when partition took place, violence in Sindh was minimal. If you read the stories of Khushwant Singh or Sadat Hassan Manto, or see films like Garam Hawa or Tamas, you see that there was so much violence in other places, like in Punjab and Bengal, but Sindh was relatively peaceful. And I always wondered why this was so. And I got some of the answers when reading Sindhi Tapestries. I came to know that, for example, in Sindh, it was the enlightened Sufistic way of life that encouraged bonding and friendship between Hindus and Muslims, the minority community and the majority community. Sindh was 75% Muslim and 25% Hindu. Since the annexation of Sindh by Muhammad bin Qasim in 711, Sindh was part of the Muslim world, and Sindh was the only place in the subcontinent that had a majority of Muslims. And this was interesting because even the geographical location of Sindh was such that it was treated more as a transition zone. It was a pathway, as it were, and people from Turkey, Iran entered through the passes, through the western passes, and through these passes came Sufis. These Sufis were peaceful people, and they taught the message of love and humanity and unity. And this interested me a lot when I read some of the essays in Saz's book, because it is a well-known fact that in Sindh, Muslims did not attend temples. Hindus did not attend mosques, but they all attended the dargahs. At the dargahs, the Hindus and the Muslims prayed to the peers, because they believed a peer continued to help his followers even after his death. So this was what united the Hindus and the Muslims and brought them together, and Sindh remained peaceful for a long time after partition was declared. This example fascinated me, and I began to read a little bit more about Sufism, and we can see that these Sufis came to Sindh, and this whole system of continuing to worship at dargahs continues today also. There are organizations in Bombay where Sindhis meet, and there is also a place in Sion which is a Sufi center which sends out notices of meetings, and Sindhis meet in homes, and trips are organized even to Ajmer Sharif, which is the tomb of Muhyiddin Chishti. Sindhis regularly go there. Of course, during the COVID time, there has been nothing of visiting Ajmer. But in the past, trips have been organized and people go there and pray at the tomb of Muhyiddin Chishti. And this really fascinated me because even A.R. Rahman, the well-known singer, has a beautiful song, Khwaja Mere Khwaja, which is dedicated to Muhyiddin Chishti. And yeah, and you all might be also familiar with Mast Kalandar, where the three deities are seen together. There is Ali, the son-in-law of Muhammad the Prophet. There is Jhulelal, and there is Mast Kalandar. So all these three deities are seen together. This too is a song that brings the two communities together. So there was so much in common between the majority community and the minority community that it's fascinating to look at this and see why the situation today is so different. Today, nobody sees different communities behave in different ways, and there is friction. But in Sindh, it was amazing. And I read in Sindhi Tapestries also, when the Sindhis were leaving Sindh, their Muslim neighbors and friends were embracing them and hugging them and pleading with them not to leave. And they gave refuge also. When the riots started, they gave them refuge in their own homes. So this relationship meant so much to me, and I've always wondered why things have changed so much. So in their worship, there was so much similarity. And again, when I think of Cheti Chand, and I see, in Sindh was partially a desert. A large part of Sindh was desert, and it was our Sindhu Nadi, our river, that flowed and gave so much happiness to the people. When the river started inundating, there were festivals on the banks of the river. Here there's a beautiful picture of people performing the Cheja, the dance, which today also happens. I know that it happens in some areas of Bombay. Whenever there is, at the time of the inundation, of course, around March, the Indus started its inundation, water began to flow, it was perceptible a little later, and in August it was full swing. This was the time when people in Sindh got together and celebrated, and the Behrana was held as an offering to the sea god, to Jhulelal. Here you have an image of Jhulelal sitting cross-legged on the lotus and the fish. And this was a big ceremony in Sindh. The Behrana consisted of a thar decorated with flowers and fruits and a little rice. It was offered to the sea god. And this was interesting because the majority community also celebrated Jhulelal, but they called him Khwaja Khazir. There were other names given to the same deity. The same deity was worshipped, but there were other names given. So this also showed the unity between the two communities. You can see Jhulelal's picture there, and you can also see, I think, the sea in the distance, Sindhu Nadi. And this custom continues in Bombay today also. Not only is the Behrana a big ceremony, I know that at our Mahalakshmi temple we celebrate it but also when anyone in the family is about to travel, the akho is offered to the sea, just as it was in Sindh, when Sindhwarkis went out to travel for their journeys for 3 years, for their musafiris. Their wives would stand at the banks praying for them and offering akho to the waters, to the sea gods, to preserve their husbands and their sons and to bring them back safely. So this custom of offering akho to the sea or to any river near the house is a custom which we follow today as well. Shah Abdul Latif also in his Samundi number 13, which I've just learned to read a little, talks about the maidens standing and crying and praying to the sea god to give them a safe journey. Because as you know, Sindhwarki merchants sailed across the seas much before any other community. So all these stories in Sadhu's book also are extremely fascinating. And I've talked about how we Sindhis have developed this habit of, many of us, I know in my family, we certainly have, of also always having a secret pocket in our clothes so that we can carry precious stuff safely. And in my family, this started with, at the time of partition, my family was in Quetta because my father had a tea trading business and he traveled from Quetta to Kabul and Afghanistan and sold his goods in those places. He traveled through the Bolan Pass. But anyway, when the riots broke out in Quetta, his tea godown was burnt. This was, of course, in 1947 August. And I think the story goes that there was some conflict between some Muslims and Pathans, and the riot started in Quetta. So when the riot started in Quetta and my father's tea godown was burnt down, he decided that there was no way but to leave. So my mother immediately stitched a belt and they stuffed it with gold coins, with gold sovereigns, whatever jewels and precious stuff they had, and he tied it around his waist. And on top of that came his underwear and his vest and his loose shirt. And when he traveled from Quetta to Karachi to the steamship Sonavati, to Gujarat, Jam Khambalia, all the way he was absolutely safe. He was able to carry his hoard of gold in this secret belt. And this has become a sort of device which my family has learnt, and we all have secret pockets stuffed into our clothes, stitched into our clothes, and this helps a lot. And with this money which my father, with these gold guineas which he brought with him, he restarted his tea trading business in Calcutta. Thank you, Saz. Yes.
Thank you, Shakun, for that lovely talk. It was really interesting. You covered so much, right from Sufi nature to the water worship, and then you moved on from these cultural characteristics to the characteristics which are a legacy of partition, like the secret pocket and the other things you mentioned. Thank you so much. So now I wanted to say, before I pass this on to Dr. Subhash Bijlani, who's going to sum up for us, I noticed that we have audience members from all around the world. And it's very nice to see Sindhis who are from Sindh also participating in this. Welcome to this event. Thank you so much for joining us. Yeah, thank you, Subhash.
Well, first of all, thank you, Saz, and thank you to Kama Institute for making this happen. And greetings from where I am in the United States, in the outskirts of Washington, D.C. And summing up is more difficult, Saz, than writing your whole book. It's been such a wide spectrum that you have covered in this get together. But I want to start with what Matt said, and I think he took reference from the cover of your book on tapestry, and he highlighted that cover and that tapestry, Sindhi tapestry, as a symbol of cultural identity where different patterns are intertwined and kind of inextricably interwoven. But you know, there are two ways to look at that that tapestry. One is to look at it as a disjointed patchwork, where one patch is randomly thrown with the other. The other is the way that I visualize that tapestry, is that regardless of the differences of what they represent, they are kind of strewn together, they're stitched together, they're brought together, and they're not separated, they're not separable. And I think that's a symbolic way to start looking at what Sindhi identity is. And I think Matt has done seminal work in looking at the role of language in sustaining culture. And I think he said, he referred to one writing, one culture. And that gives me some cause of concern personally, because I see, rather than bringing this kind of unifying this culture with one way of writing, there is now a fragmentation of that identity more than what we experienced post-partition. The attempt of changing the script in which Sindhi is written in post-partition India is going to cause a further fragmentation of what you and I will call Sindhi identity. And I'll come to that at the end. As a parallel, the only other parallel I can find, and Matt can correct me, is in Kemal Atatürk in Turkey in 1920s and 30s, where he changed the script of Turkish language to Latin. And that was a massive change. But unlike in Turkey, there were not two separate places which had spoken language Turkish in which one script was changed and the other remained as it was. So I think it's a matter of concern, and we need to examine how, if ever, we are going to bring that single culture without getting the identity too fragmented. And I was fascinated by Maya David's presentation, where she said, where her study or her inquiry is focused not if people moved away from their language, but why did they move away from their language? And she has widely quoted from the book, where actually shows the emphasis on assimilation. That post-partition generation was so determined, and it was so required of them to be assimilated in a land that they did not know. And I think my generation, which is kind of grown up in that that environment, find it very difficult to fathom what it must be. For all practical purposes, from cultural and linguistic point of view, they actually entered a foreign country. There was a certain notional sense of nationhood and statehood by being an India or an Indian. But I grew up in different parts of India. My father got his job in Calcutta. Till today, my two brothers speak more fluent Bengali than they can ever speak Sindhi, and for that matter, even Hindi. So they're very, very fluent. And my brother's grandchildren are now fluent in Marathi. So that was one driving force that we needed to assimilate and make success of what we wanted. The other one was really a negative force, and that was not to be seen as the other. And most Sindhis growing up, and it's recounted in SARS in the book that you have edited, that they were considered, and in some places still are, as outsiders, whether it was the surname that did not sound well. And I remember filling up forms growing up when I was asked to state my caste and my village, and I really didn't have one village or caste. Where do you belong? Where do you come from? And invariably we would say we come from Delhi. So I think there was this struggle to not be seen as the other. And some of us succeeded very well and others did not. But that otherness of Sindhis, I think, remains. And I think it is in the book, and let me show you the book that I've been reading by, you see this cover? So this is by Matthew Cook and Michael Boyvin. And I like one expression that used there is called de-terrorize. Is it de-terrori? Basically, it says your territory has been denied. You are de-terrorized community. And that is very unique because that was not the sense of loss suffered by Punjab. They did not lose their language the way Sindhis did. That was not the case with Bengal. And therefore, this idea that the territory doesn't belong to us has also been a motivating force for Sindhis to try and turn their backs, as it were, on their language, certainly in that generation and the present generation. So in a way, I see Sindhi identity, the struggle for Sindhi identity is not the same as in other diaspora, such as Tamilians in Singapore or Malayalis in Middle East or Bangladeshis in UK. I think our search for identity is different. The other point that strikes me is this struggle to seek one's identity is not high on agenda in the generation, the first generation. And we've seen this in all immigrant communities, whether it's Armenians, whether it is even the African Americans in the United States. And Matt would agree that it's only recently, relatively recently past, that African American community in the United States has started to look at its own past squarely in the eyes. And that, I think, was symbolized by the book that came out, I think it was in mid-1970s, by Alex Haley, called The Roots. And now we have TV programs where African Americans actually search for their roots and are quite accepting of the fact that their forefathers were smuggled out of Africa and came as slaves. I do not believe it was possible to discuss that with that degree of maturity, say 30 or 40 years ago. So I think a time is coming where we are also able to look at our past, and I think as I made a note that as Matthew Cook has suggested, that a Sindhi future and identity can be built only by understanding the community's past. And I think also in his book, he says that states are unlikely arbiters of people's long-term relationships. I was very excited to hear about Nandu's personal experience, and it speaks about the irrepressible spirit of enterprise. And that is not only in the spirit of enterprise in Sindhis, is not only when they do trade or business and keep shops in commerce, but I see that state in enterprise in every profession and every walk of life. And he talked about reinventing themselves. And I look at my own life, where I started as an industry manager and quickly adopted to academics to be here at the University of Maryland. So I ascribe that a lot to my refugee state of mind, where we adopt and feel at ease wherever we are. And I think we owe a lot to that. And again, by adding historical depth, the Sindhi experience helps understand the migration, and I believe it also helps us to understand globalization in a broader context. And to Shakuntala Bharwani's interesting observation about the advent of Islam in 8th century, I think we need to remind ourselves that although Islam came to Sindh in 8th century with Muhammad bin Qasim, Sindh did not convert to Islam for another 700 years after arrival of Islam, partly because of the dynasties of Somras and Samas had ruled after that. So I am so excited that we have had this opportunity to share our thoughts, listen to each other, and it has whetted our appetite. And I'm particularly pleased that we have our colleagues from across the border from Sindh in Pakistan. And it is my hope that when we recount our experiences, it's not just the experiences of the Hindu Sindhis who crossed the border and came into what I still think was a foreign land for generation before me. I think we also need to capture the experiences of Sindhis, how it was, who were there in Sindh, Hindus or Muslims. We need to try and capture their ethos and their condition before we begin to understand Sindhi identity. So I hope we will have the opportunity and the courage to bring both these together, because that is what finally will define Sindhi identity. So thank you, Sas, for giving me the opportunity. And I know it's impossible to sum up, but this is my best attempt.
Sudash, that was brilliant. I knew you'd do it. You really, brought out each of the speakers' insights from their talks and wove it together with your own absolutely inimitable way. Thank you very much for doing that. I can see there are a few questions already. And in fact, one of them, I think, Subhash, you might be able to take. So Nalini was talking, she's talking about the intersection of Sikhism with mainstream Hinduism in terms of how Sindhis assimilated this faith. And I know you have a lot to say about this. Would you mind taking this up?
Yes, certainly. My own life is intertwined with Sikhism, as of many Sindhis, not simply because we go and worship at Gurdwaras, but also because I was brought up as a small child, and I have written that in my essay, by a Sikh, Sindhi, and he stayed with the family for forever. I have described how my father, who was then the sessions judge in Sakhar, the twin city of Rohiri, how he had the responsibility of getting him across the border, being a Sikh. But I did not know that there were whole villages of Sindhi Sikhs till this particular domestic help, Sardar Jaman Singh, caught up with me over 40 years later in Chandigarh, where I was living. And he came and he then sat, and I have his recordings with me of describing how he came to work with my father in Thatta, where I was born, and how he did not speak a word of Punjabi. So there was a strong Sikh element. And also in many Sindhi families, the eldest son was actually given to Sikhism. And I remember so many occasions that I was addressed as Sardar because I am the eldest of the son in the family. But I think a more deeper understanding of Sikhism is actually in the book of essays that Matthew Cook and Michael Boyman have written. So I strongly recommend you, those who are interested can actually see that, how historical growth of Nanak Sindhi.
Thank you. Thanks for that, Subhash. So Nalini, is there anything you'd like to add, or would you like to comment? Would you like to respond?
No, I just want to thank you for that. Thanks a lot, Mr. Bijlani. And I think, Saz, thanks a lot for making many of us a little more aware of these roots, because it's so wonderful to see so many younger than us, so much older than us. We've been quite alienated from our own roots, as you know. And thank you for doing this through multiple books and multiple efforts. I just want to express my gratitude.
Thanks. So, Matt, would you like to respond to Subhash? I mean, yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Subhash, and thank you everyone else for your comments. Just real quickly on patchwork, the aim that I had today was to try to illustrate how Sindhi society and culture prior to partition was threaded, if you will, more tightly together than a sort of patchwork would suggest. So that was really what I wanted to do. And of course, partition changes so much the community. So that particular argument, of course, becomes a little more difficult to sustain following partition. And then the issue of one language, one culture, one territory. The point I wanted to make there was really that that's a colonial linguistic ideology, or what we call language ideology in linguistic anthropology. So that is something that in some ways is imposed. And, we see this in lots of communities. I'm married into a family from Rajasthan, and, my wife is fluent, of course, in Mewari, Rajasthani, Punjabi, Hindi, Gujarati, Sanskrit, and even just learned Persian. So, this multilingual sort of existence is very common in South Asia, and often they're connected to certain particular identities. And those, of course, in Burton's report, get erased completely out of the incredibly dynamic and tightly threaded and wound society that characterizes the Sindh region prior to partition. And one more just sort of idea, Subhash, and it sort of riffs off of something that you said. And I think about it on a personal level, because I didn't grow up in the United States, although I'm a US citizen. I grew up overseas in Africa, the Middle East, and Europe. My parents taught in international schools. And I don't think of my own sort of relationship with my own society and culture as sort of, or anywhere I am, as being equally at ease or at ease everywhere, but as actually being equally uncomfortable everywhere. And I'm not sure if that, is something that members of the community, feel, or how they feel about it. But I know that that's how I sort of feel, having, grown up almost entirely out of my own country and having returned to it only, when I was in my late teens. And so it might be another way to sort of think about that is, not equally comfortable everywhere, but just equally uncomfortable everywhere as an idea. So just a thought. As I said, I haven't followed that thread up with my own interactions, but it's something people might think about.
Matt, thank you for introducing ourselves to your background. You have just earned yourself a title of being a Sindhi and a Muhajir.
Well done.
Sas?
Yeah.
Sas?
Yeah.
Can I respond to a question by Jaishri Laila?
Please. Thanks, Maya.
Jaishri in her chat says, how can we keep the Sindhi language alive, because the young are all speaking English and Hindi? So that's a very good question. How do you keep the language alive if people are already used to using other languages? How is there revitalization? In social linguistics, we use the word revitalization of the language. And I think through webinars, many webinars organized by Sindhis in India, they are trying to create a sense of pride in being Sindhi. And they are equating being Sindhi to speaking the language. But I note that in these webinars, often they shift to English or Hindi in their discourse. So it's a battle. It's a fighting battle. It's not easy if you've already been used to other languages for a long time since childhood to revert back to what is considered your mother's mother tongue. It's no longer your mother tongue. So it's an uphill battle, but I think the webinars organized by many associations in India are fighting that battle and trying to revive the language. So we have to give gratitude to these language activists in India. Uphill, but I think they will slowly succeed. And they're trying scholarships and so on. Like if you know, if you sit for an exam in Sindhi and you go to Sindhi schools, you get scholarships. And so there are monetary rewards coming in, and there are other rewards like prizes and competitions and so on, trying to encourage people to come back to their language. As I said, it's not easy. It's an uphill battle. Let's see if it will succeed.
Thank you. Thanks, Maya. Matt, you want to say something?
Yeah, I just want to sort of follow up on what Maya said and then link it also back to Josh. You know, I put a link to an article in Modern Asian Studies that Maya and I just published in the chat. And, you know, I won't go into the details of it all, but I suggest maybe people are interested on the issue of language shift and culture to take a look. Because what we argue, Maya and I argue in that particular essay, is that language shift doesn't mean cultural shift. They don't automatically imply each other in the context of the Sindhi diaspora. And you know, this is an argument that both of us sort of came upon independently, and then in our conversations discovered we were actually making the same arguments, but using different case material. In my case, it was from the India case material after 47 and partition. In the case of Maya, it was from case material she would be working on regarding Southeast Asia. So one thing to sort of maybe keep in mind, again, and this does sort of, you know, harken back to the colonial language ideology of one territory, one language, one culture, is that language shift and change doesn't necessarily imply in reality and on the ground in terms of people's social interaction, cultural change or cultural shift within the community. And if you're interested in following up on that argument, you can do so in that that article that we published in Modern Asian Studies, and I put the link in the chat for there's a
Thank you, Matt. Right, so that's been a fabulous session. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you very much. Thank you to all the contributors of Sindhi Tapestry also, some of whom are attending this session. Thank you very much, all of you. Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Maya.
Bye-bye.
Nandu. And thanks a lot, Nandu. And thanks, Shakuntala.